Legends tell of a frontiersman that it was said was always there. According to the journals of Nathan Boone, Daniel's son, Michael Stoner was an awkwardly Dutchman who spoke with a heavy German accent. Also, he was known as truthful and reliable, a man who always got the job done. In 1767, at the age of 19, Stoner accompanied Daniel Boone on his first long hunt expedition into the Kentucky country. He, along with Samuel Harrod and Boone, passed through Cumberland Gap to winter over in the difficult mountainous region of eastern Kentucky. They made their first headquarters at a place that came later to be known as Crab Orchard, named after the orchard of crab apple trees growing there. They separated here. Stoner went northwest to the falls of the Ohio, near present-day Louisville, Kentucky. After staying there a short while, he pushed south across central Kentucky to the Cumberland River, and then went down to the Cumberland to near present-day Nashville, Tennessee, where he met up with Boone, and they went back to Virginia together. This long hunt served as preparation for later expeditions that led to Kentucky's first settlement by whites into native country. The first settlement attempt into Kentucky, an unsuccessful one, was led by Daniel Boone in September 1773. He was employed by Richard Henderson, later the leader in the formation of the Transylvania Company. Among the 50 people who sat out that autumn day were William Bush and Bush's nephew, Michael Stoner, reputed to be one of the best shots in Southwest Virginia. The expedition started out too late in the year and was not sufficiently supplied. They barely covered 100 miles in the first 2 weeks, then disaster struck. The group was strung out over several miles on the trail when Boone decided that they needed more supplies. Daniel's son James, along with several others, died victim to Indian ambush while traveling back to Virginia to buy more food. It was a time of despair. The group turned back. They were not yet ready for Kentucky. We next hear of Michael Stoner again acting with Boone just before the outbreak of Dunmore's War. This predecessor to the Revolutionary War happened mainly along the Ohio and Hocking Rivers between Fort Pitt and Point Pleasant during the late summer of 1774. It may have been an attempt by John Murray, Earl of Dunmore and governor of the colony of Virginia, to divert the resources and attention of his subjects away from the unrest developing in Boston and Philadelphia. More likely, though, is that the whole thing was carried out to secure large sections of the Ohio country for groups of wealthy and influential land speculators, not the least of whom was Dunmore himself. At any rate, teams of surveyors had been out for the last year or so establishing claim to as much of the Ohio country as they could lay instruments to for their shadowy employers. In the spring before the campaign, in April of 1774, Dunmore asked for 2 good men as volunteers to go out and warn the survey teams of hostiles to come in time for them to escape the war zone unharmed. The first to volunteer was Michael Stoner. The second was Daniel Boone. The two were directed to go to the Ohio to the falls just downstream from present-day Louisville, Kentucky. The falls, really little more than a set of rapids, have long since been blasted away to improve the navigability of the river. And then to turn inland following the string of surveyors and ordering them to return in Dunmore's name. They traveled around 800 miles in 62 days through increasingly hostile territory under very difficult conditions. Trails were scarce to non-existent, and the Indians, having been harassed by invading bands of ruffians for the last year, were finally beginning to strike back. The 2 men traveled together. Boone's journal of the expedition recounts an incident where, at Salt Lick, Stoner taunted a buffalo. The animal, a cow, reacted by charging him. According to Boone, Stoner ran away shouting, "Shoot her, Captain, shoot her!" Boone found the whole thing was so funny that he couldn't stop laughing enough to do anything. Stoner remembered living constantly in fear of Indian ambush, such as that whenever they stopped, they would sit back to back so as to not be surprised from any direction. However, they accomplished their mission and the surveying teams were able to safely withdraw. Among those enemies, the most formidable were certainly the Shawnee. Boonesboro got its introduction to the Revolutionary War in its first trial by fire in the spring of 1777. The British had urged restraint to their Indian allies in 1776, but the Ohio Indians, after their experience in Dunmore's War, saw gains by the Americans as nothing other than threats to themselves and their lands. So by the spring of 1777, the arguments of the peace chiefs were being rejected, and war chiefs such as the Shawnee Blackfish had taken command. Blackfish led an army of 200 Shawnee warriors south across the Ohio that spring. In all of Kentucky that year, there were 121 men available to defend the 280 settlers living there. Among the 22 men available to defense of the 10 or 15 families living in Boonesboro was Michael Stoner. What happened at Boonesboro that spring was a major occurrence in the lives of the four of the most famous long hunters on the frontier: Michael Stoner, Daniel Boone, William Bush, and Simon Kenton. It was an experience that led them to bond for the rest of their lives. Harrodsburg had endured sporadic attacks since early March, but much smaller Boonesboro remained unbothered until April 24th. As luck would have it, in the morning, the scouts would normally have been out there in the forest. Stoner and Simon Kenton included were all in the fort, so there was no forewarning. The first sign of trouble was when the cows refused to go out the pasture. They would go out no further than the gate of the fort. Boone, acting as militia captain, sent 2 men out to investigate. They saw nothing unusual. As they were coming back to the fort, a small group of Shawnee ran out of the sycamore tree grove in a nearby hollow and fired at them. This sycamore hollow was to be a major weak point in the defense of Boonesboro. The 2 men ran for the open gate about 70 yards away. One was brought down, and a small group of Indians quickly overwhelmed him and set to work lifting his scalp. Simon Kenton was standing at the gate with his gun loaded. As one warrior rose from the crowd screaming his war cry and waved aloft his bloody trophy, Kenton impulsively charged him from the fort, stopped short, aimed, and shot the warrior dead. The other Shawnees scattered into the forest. Very quickly, Kenton was joined on the plain in the front of the fort by Boone, Michael Stoner, and William Bush, and 10 to 12 others. They immediately spread out in pursuit of the disappearing Shawnees. Stoner was a few yards ahead of the rest when he saw a warrior moving and hiding along the rail fence to the west. He fired and hit his mark, but before he could reload, he himself was hit twice in return fire. One ball went through his wrist, another lodged in his hip. The Kentuckians, as they came to Stoner's defense, heard a sound of many footsteps closing behind them. Looking back, they saw a lane leading back to the fort filling with several dozen Shawnees who had been hiding in that same sycamore hollow. They were cut off. "Boys, we have to fight," Boone shouted. "Sell your lives as dear as possible." With that, they charged. Individuals stopped to fire when opportunities offered themselves. Then they would dash forward, raising to his own horrific war cry. A witness reported that Kentuckians made right at them, near enough to see the white of many an eye. The Indians would always give way. Some records hint that the Indians did so because they were in hopes of capturing them all for their own purposes, probably to use them to persuade the fort to surrender. Others report that this was simply an example of the Indians' fighting style, being cautious about going into hand-to-hand combat and favoring a more wait for a favorable opportunity then attack approach. However, the Kentuckians broke through, but not without sustaining several more injuries, Boone being among the first. He was shot through the ankle, went down, and was saved from being scalped by Simon Kenton, who clubbered the warrior attacking Boone to death. Kenton hoisted Boone up over his shoulders and ran to the fort, Indian bullets humming all around the two of them all the way. Stoner and Bush were the last to come in. Bush had fired twice already and had put the powder in the gun and was holding the bullet in his mouth, preparing for a third shot when he saw Stoner faltering from loss of blood. Throwing his arm around his nephew, he began to pull him along, but Stoner shook it off. "Tim got him, yellow rascals will get us. We are too pig for this mark," Pitty Posh, he shouted. Stoner hobbled ahead of Bush, held the Indians back, leveled up his empty gun at them, and was about to fire. Looking around, he saw that all of his comrades had made it to safety to the fort, so he spun around and began to run. He saw the Indians aim their guns, heard the discharges, and saw balls crashing down all around him. He was not hit, but by the time he passed through the gate, his legs had been extensively cut by gravel and stone kicked up by the Indian shots. The Indians had wanted to take Bush prisoner and held their fire until it was obvious that they were not going to be able to capture him. Thus, he escaped. The Shawnees kept up intermittent fire for a while, but they soon left, taking their dead and wounded along with them. Later in Harrodsburg, Kenton reported to George Rogers Clark, colonel of Virginia militia charged with the defense of Kentucky, that 40 or 50 Indians attacked Boonesboro, killed and scalped Goodman, wounded Captain Boone, Captain Todd, Mr. Height, and Mr. Stoner. Indians, 'tis thought, sustained much damage. Stoner recovered from his wounds and stayed on through the following year in and around Boonesboro, acting as a scout and hunter for the settlement. He was with George Rogers Clark at the final taking of Vincennes in February of 1779, and he may have been with him during his entire campaign to the west. On a visit in western North Carolina, Stoner was caught up in the forces leading the Battle of Kings Mountain, which took place on October 12, 1780. That was where the British lost their paramount weapons researcher, Major Patrick Ferguson. He was commander of the Loyalist troops trapped on Kings Mountain and virtually annihilated by the American force composed almost entirely of Virginia and Carolina frontiersmen. 400 of the original 1,200 Loyalists lived to surrender after a sniper cut Major Ferguson down. An ironic footnote to this incident was that Ferguson, an extraordinary marksman himself, as well as an inventor of the first breech-loading flintlock rifle used in England, had specifically been assigned to kill George Washington at the Battle of Germantown by sniping him across the battlefield. Ferguson found Washington and had him in his sights, but not being able to believe that a general officer would dress so casually, he concluded that his target could not be Washington and held his fire. Later in 1782, Stoner was wounded in the Battle of Blue Licks in present-day central Kentucky. This battle was often cited as the last engagement of the Revolutionary War. It was the end of the last British campaign in the West and involved the force of 600 from the north of the Ohio, including 50 British regulars under Captain William Caldwell. The rest of the army consisted of Indians from the various Ohio nations. Among their leaders was the notorious Simon Gerty. The invaders crossed the Ohio in late August or early September. There, about 350 of the force set itself up in the camp, while it remained 250, including the 50 redcoats, proceeded further inland and attacked Bryan's Station. Various militia groups, totaling some 180 or so men, assembled in Lexington and came to reinforce the station, only to find the besiegers gone. Convinced by the British presence that they were chasing the entire invading force, the Kentuckians went in pursuit, following them back to their main camp at the Blue Licks. Charging across the Licking River into what they thought to be a camp of a force of approximately the same size as theirs, the Kentuckians ran into an ambush that dealt them their most severe defeat in their long border war with the Ohio Indian nations. 72 of the Kentuckians were killed in that battle. The Indians, for it was largely an Indian action, lost only 3, and 4 others were slightly wounded. The remaining Kentuckians fled back across the Licking River in panic. Stoner was wounded early in the fight and fell from his horse. He hid in the bushes until the day after the battle, when he was rescued by militia reinforcements under Colonel Benjamin Logan. Logan arrived a day too late to help the Kentuckians. They knew he was coming with several hundred men, but instead of waiting for him, they resorted to their usual tactic of a head-on charge into the fray immediately after their first contact with an enemy. Stoner later participated in various campaigns up into the Ohio country that were part of the Indian Wars that raged across the eastern United States following the Revolutionary War. These conflicts have traditionally been granted only a few paragraphs in most general American history books. Re-examination of these times show them to be a part of a pivotal era in American history. Well, thank you guys for watching this video, and if you like this video and videos like this, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, share it with your friends, and as always, remember to get out there and explore. Thanks, guys.